we've taken the opportunity of Paul Cornish's presence here to have this public seminar on the back of a public forum we had last week with all of our visitors. But I think Paul has got some particular insights and a background that will bring, I think, an interesting perspective to these issues. I'm going to ask Roger Bradbury to formally introduce Paul, but I'd just like to say, on behalf of all of us at the college, it's been wonderful having Paul and John and Fred here this week, and we look forward to what I hope will be a very productive partnership.
Thanks, Michael. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to just tell you very briefly about our political ecology project. This is an international and interdisciplinary project in looking at the major actors in cyberspace and how they might move forward in time, how they might interact, and how we might be able to adjust policy settings to better cope with the changes caused by those interactions. So, in a sense, it's an ecological problem, and we don't apologise for using that metaphor. Paul Cornish, who will be our speaker, is Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of Exeter, and he's got some very original thoughts on why we should call this a political ecology and what it might mean. So I'd like you to welcome Paul. He's well known to many people in strategic studies. He, as a former professor of international studies at Chatham House, and a member of the Oxford, the new Oxford research group on cyber security. So, without further ado, Paul Cornish. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much. And first of all, can I thank Professor Lestrange, Michael, for your enormous hospitality for this week, and all of your colleagues here at the National Security College, and a particular thank you to Roger Bradbury, who has organised what I have to say is possibly the most gruelling, not to say brutal, brainstorming research week I've ever had the, well, I guess the word is pleasure, of attending. Roger urged me not to use, well, two words I mustn't use in my opening remarks. One of them, because he said these would be very smug and insensitive, he said, for heaven's sake, don't mention rugby or cricket. And he also said it'd be very unsporting as well to mention the fact that the weather in England is probably better than it has been here in the last few days. So I won't do any of those things. As a result, though, I have to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to what must be, therefore, the second most interesting speech in Canberra today. Let me begin with a couple of thoughts about where we are with the web, with the internet, with cyberspace. According to the International Telecommunications Union, some 38% of the world's population of around 7 billion, let's say, have access to the internet. And you'll know that Eric Schmidt, the executive chairman of Google, has claimed that by the end of the current decade, the entire global population will be online. And his remarks, you'll also know, have been met with some skepticism in certain quarters. But even if by a more cautious, conservative estimate, let's say, for point of argument, just 2/3 of humanity were to be online by 2020, then this rate of take-up could only, I think, be described as revolutionary. Not just technologically, but also, I think, more significantly, much more significantly, in terms of politics. The expanding global communication infrastructure brings with it the possibility, some might say perhaps the nightmare, of a worldwide conversation across all dimensions of human life: cultural, economic, religious, diplomatic, commercial, family, individual, non-governmental, governmental, you name it. It's all there, it's all possible. And communication and conversation also, of course, are made possible for criminal and terrorist and other adverse behaviors. Now, in most of these cases of human interaction, whether legitimate or otherwise, customs and protocols and rules of the road emerge with usage. It's noticeable, though, that where government interactions are concerned, there is a tendency, certainly among policy analysts, perhaps if no one else, to revert to established ideas and methods with which to stabilise and then to manage competitive strategic relations. Now, often these ideas and methods are drawn from the experience of the Cold War. But while I accept that cyberspace should be managed, and this will be the point of my remarks this evening, should be managed as a strategically significant arena of human interaction and contestation, and I also accept that the East-West confrontation of the 20th century might offer certain lessons in the modalities of strategic management. I accept all of that. I believe, nevertheless, that a closer understanding is required of the particular nature of cyberspace, lest the lessons of the past are applied inappropriately. The depth and the breadth of the cyber strategic problem, if I can call it that, becomes most apparent when we consider the schizophrenic adversarial relationship between China and the West. This curious blend of close and mutually beneficial economic and commercial interaction with ostensibly zero-sum diplomatic and strategic animosity. With Western governments and civil society and the private sector and everybody else all expecting ever more of the internet, the cyber relationship with China is becoming ever more significant. And for their part, Chinese government officials and commercial representatives are also aware of the benefits, commercial, social, economic, reputational, and so on, to be gained from the internet and indeed from more transparent and constructive cyber relations with the West. They get it too. But in spite of all these positive indicators, the discourse I find to be dominated by a sense of chronic animosity, with a seemingly endless drip feed of reports of cyber espionage alleged to have originated in, I'm choosing my words carefully, alleged to have originated in China and to be aimed at Western commercial and national security interests, and these being met with very trenchant denials from China. I'm going to suggest that cyberspace is of such strategic significance that it cannot be allowed to be the digital age equivalent either of the lawless Wild West or of the Cold War strategic standoff. And equally, I'll suggest that the achievement of a strategically stable, mature, and rule-governed cyberspace is unlikely to come about, either as the result of a technological solution of some sort, in attribution perhaps, or through permissive self-organization. But it's at this point that a fundamental challenge arises: how to ensure that a cooperative and mutually beneficial cyber environment emerges, and on whose terms? Well, I'm going to suggest that we should try to see cyberspace as a tractable space, as an arena which we have created and which we can recreate, and in which meaningful strategic interaction can be had. And the first step towards this goal, I argue, should be to understand cyberspace as an emergent ecology in which human beings interact with each other and with the environment in which they find themselves. So I'm going to begin with a few words on what I see as the strategic problem of cyberspace, focusing on relations between China and the West. And I'll then examine a range of responses, very briefly, which I consider to be superficial, frankly. And then finally, I'll discuss this idea of a strategic ecology of cyberspace and how its evolution might be encouraged. So what is the strategic problem? Chinese cyber intrusions. The nature of the debate between the United States and the West more broadly, and China on the other hand, can only be described, I think, as bleak. In the US, a pessimistic outlook runs very deep. US companies, large and small, and in many sectors of the economy, are under assault by sophisticated and persistent cyber espionage operations. Some of these attacks originate in Russia, but most of them come from China. In the same article I just quoted from, Mr. Eric Rosenbach, US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy, is reported to consider the theft of intellectual property to be, quote, a very grave national security threat. US civil society is also believed to be under threat, with the US House of Representatives Intelligence Committee identifying US policy think tanks as key, quote, key targets in a furious wave of cyber espionage aimed at US government and business by China and other countries. Similar assessments, you'll know, are to be found in the United Kingdom. Quote, hostile attacks on UK cyberspace by other states and large-scale cybercrime, unquote, is considered by the current edition of the UK National Security Strategy to be a Tier 1 priority risk. Tier 1 priority risk. In August 2013, just a few months ago, therefore, a report leaked to the Guardian newspaper from the Cybersecurity Operations Centre, our own CSOC at GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, reportedly claimed that China has a capable and very wide-ranging cyber program targeting the full spectrum of governmental, military, and commercial targets. And in today's news, I read that Australia's Secret Intelligence Service has also been hacked by Anonymous, albeit possibly out of Indonesia. This mood, fluctuating between chronic mistrust and acute anger, was taken to new depths, of course, in May of this year with the release of a mass of highly classified US and UK signals intelligence to the Guardian newspaper by Edward Snowden, formerly, as you all know, an employee of the CIA and a contractor at the National Security Agency. And aren't they just checking over their vetting processes as we speak? Snowden's actions had an immediate and profound effect on the intelligence community in both the US and the United Kingdom, which I know best, obviously. In the United States, James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, said it was for him, quote, literally, not figuratively, literally, gut-wrenching to see this happen because of the huge, grave damage it does to our intelligence capabilities. And in the UK, Sir David Omand, a former director of GCHQ, described the Snowden leaks as the most, quote, catastrophic loss to British intelligence ever. And he reportedly claimed that Snowden's actions eclipsed the exploits of the Cambridge spy ring, whose 5 members leaked information to the Soviet Union during the Second World War and the Cold War. That's an insider giving some sense of the damage that's being caused by this. And similar comments, you'll know, were made last week in the House of Commons Intelligence and Security Committee evidence session, when for the first time they had the heads of all 3 UK agencies. In each of the 2 countries I referred to, the Snowden affair prompted an urgent review of the constitutional and political arrangements by which the work of their respective intelligence and security agencies is governed. The episode also had a dampening effect on diplomatic relations between the US and the UK on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other. The latter 2 had both been, as you all know, dismissive of US requests to extradite Snowden, and both are assumed to be taking their time to decrypt sensitive US and British intelligence material. That's the problem. Let me go on then to some responses to the problem, which I consider to be superficial. I see 2 common types of response. The first is to persist in viewing the problem of cybersecurity through the prism of traditional strategy and state-on-state conflict. And the second is to adopt the conviction politics of what I've called here rights and rescue, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment or 2. First, state-on-state conflict, and I guess you'll know where I'm going with this. In February of this year, Mandiant, an information security company based in Washington, published a report entitled APT1, exposing one of China's cyber espionage units, and the report made a number of claims. In a gesture of even-handedness, the report also included a stiff denial from the Chinese Ministry of Defense. But for my purposes this evening, what I think is most indicative of the mood of the moment in the US and elsewhere is another extract from the report, in this case quoting US Congressional Representative Mr. Mike Rogers, who said this: let me take you into just a tiny bit of COD textual analysis. Whatever position is adopted regarding these accusations, whether you think they're measured or exaggerated or inflammatory or proportionate, this is quite clearly, in my view, the language of confrontation. And I make no judgment as to whether it's right or wrong. This is confrontation rather than cooperation. Rogers does write or speak of diplomatic and economic leverage. But whether justifiable or otherwise, as I keep saying, his general choice of language, which you can see in red, I think is vivid. Intolerable, confront, piracy, trade war, band together, scourge, and so on. And I think this suggests, to me at least, anything other than a wish for confidence-building conversation and diplomatic compromise. I'm simply drawing the conclusion from the words I see in the report. As I keep saying, I'm making no judgment as to whether this is reasonable or unreasonable. But the most striking feature of this report, in my view, is much more to do with images than with words. The next slide I'm going to show you is taken from, of all things, the CIA archive covering the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Read the caption carefully. Initial identification of medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. MRBM launch site #1 in San Cristobal. You all have seen these in every lecture you've ever done about crisis management and so on and so forth. You'll know that photographic exhibits, as he called them, of this sort were produced by Adlai Stevenson, US ambassador to the United Nations, in his dramatic confrontation with Valerian Zorin, his Soviet counterpart, in October 1962. Really vivid moment. You know, you'll remember, I'll wait till hell freezes till I get your answer, Ambassador, all that kind of stuff. Could hardly have been more dramatic. My second exhibit is taken from page 15 of the Mandiant report. The caption to this photograph reads as follows: Unit 61398, Center Building, 208 Datong, bracket, rear view, possible generator exhausts visible, close bracket. Now, I've got no wish and no reason, honestly, to question the quality or the conclusions of the work undertaken by Mandiant, and least of all to ridicule serious and expert people. My point is much more general than that. Although I might well be completely mistaken, I sense in this exhibit a faint whiff of the Stevenson-Zorin encounter. The obvious problem, of course, is that the 1962 photograph showed real missiles that had been really deployed. And the encounter in the UN could scarcely have been more dramatic or more important strategically. This second photograph exhibit shows an apartment block with some generator exhaust pipes, possibly. The second, this picture has no strategic leverage or traction whatsoever, in my view. Yet there is that unspoken wish, and I think it's the unspoken wish that is a deeper problem here, that it might actually have a little bit of traction. And it's that wish, I believe, which could turn into our nightmare. Again, I have no reason to suppose that the authors of the Mandiant report think in the way I've just described. Unfairly, I haven't asked them whether this is what they think. But I believe the folk memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis kicks in, whether we like it or not. I think it matters very much indeed how we choose to perceive and describe things. My opinion is that there is simply far too much talk of cyber war in the context of cyber relations between the West and both China and Russia. We hear of cyber Armageddon. We hear of cyber Pearl Harbor. And the best of the lot, Klickskrieg, which I love. With reference to movies such as War Games in 1983 and Die Hard 4, Thomas Rid at King's College London has observed that, quote, the threat of cyber war has captured the popular imagination. Well, sadly, this prospect seems also to have captured the imagination of policymakers and strategists, of whom I think we should probably expect a little more. My own view is that cyber warfare is a strong likelihood rather than a possibility. Cyberspace will be used in conflict, just as the land, the sea, the air, and space are used. But are we really all that surprised at that? And even if it is, cyber, I do not think, is about to become a sufficient, complete explanation for human conflict. The politics of rights and rescue, as I've called it, the second category of superficial response. And this lies in the impulse to do something. Something must be done on behalf of the digitally oppressed of China. And I have in mind the view of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in a speech in January 2010 when she emphasized access to global ICT as a right and advocated a, quote, single internet where all of humanity has equal access to knowledge and ideas. And then in a deliberate, I think, imitation, how could it be anything else, of the language of the early Cold War, Clinton spoke of, quote, a new information curtain that is descending across much of the world, end of quote. And she even referred to viral videos and blog posts as the samizdat of our day. But what then to do? Well, in fairness to Hillary Clinton, she then went on to abandon this language of confrontation and argued for mutually beneficial diplomatic understanding. She said this: in an internet-connected world, an attack on one nation's networks can be an attack on all. And by reinforcing that message, we can create norms of behavior among states and encourage respect for the global networked commons. So I come more on her side by the end of it. Others, though, take a far more activist approach. Ethan Gutmann describes, quote, the real nightmare scenario feared by the Chinese government. Sophisticated Western technology, such as advanced encryption, could end up in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party's internal enemies. Fine. But he then proceeds to argue in a way which I didn't expect as I was reading his article. Quote, only if the state's internally controlled internet is threatened will China come to the bargaining table. Well, we do know that DynaWeb and UltraReach, Freegate and the Global Internet Forum, Internet Freedom Consortium, that all of these organizations suggest that there's a level of disquiet, to say the least, within China about, quote, or the so-called Big Brother internet. As well, they suggest, is there the intellectual and technological capacity to challenge it. But is it conceivable that over time, the Big Brother internet could become so ineffective and so discredited that the Chinese government would have no choice but to see open participation in global ICT as more of a win-win opportunity than a threat? Well, if so, the question then arises as follows. Should the West support these, let's call them digital insurgents within China? And should it run the risk of Chinese government reaction, or should it simply watch and wait? The problem with that whole discussion is that it colors the PRC's dealings with Western governments in rather a crude way. Western governments' advocacy of internet freedom is seen as little more than a sort of neoconservatism for the digital age, a proxy for the West's evangelical goal to spread democracy and liberalism to all the dark corners of the earth, achieving regime change by stealth and dominating the global economic system to their advantage. Well, perhaps we should think that way. We could perhaps discuss that. But do we actually know what the costs might be of doing so? Let me turn now to this idea of there being a strategic ecology in or for cyberspace. Ecology is the study of the interaction of human beings within a given environment. And my argument, or my sense, is that a strategic ecology for cyberspace is needed. A sense of cyberspace as a rule-bound, discrete political environment in which the scope and limitations of action can be discussed, in which trade-offs can be calculated and compromise is made possible, and in which, of course, mutual interest can be pursued. Above all, I think that the strategic ecology of cyberspace has to correspond much more closely to the digital environment of the 21st century than it did to the missile environment of the 20th. And with that goal in mind, I believe we need three things. Caution, first of all, when we're applying old methods of strategic management. We need cleverness when we're in identifying and then using new methods or techniques and ideas. And we need, finally, courtesy in treating countries such as China as strategic partners rather than strategic rivals. So a couple of words on caution. Deterrence, first of all. Well, as you all know, deterrence could scarcely be said to be a new idea. It is not new, and neither was it new when early Cold War strategic theorists began their obsession with it. Rather than look simplistically for digital age equivalents of massive retaliation, mutual assured destruction, extended deterrence, assured second strike, and so on and so forth. When we do import the language of Cold War deterrence into cyberspace, I think we have to do so with a lot more imagination than we have done so far. Cold War deterrence was in large part about prevention by threat. But it was also, really importantly, an exercise in establishing mutuality, trust, and yes, conversation. And it was also, and perhaps above all, about the adaptation the adaptation of historically well-developed and profoundly human ideas to contemporary circumstances. With his typically trenchant wisdom, Professor Joseph Nye has noted that, quote, analysts are still not clear about the lessons of offense, defense, deterrence, escalation, norms, arms control, and so on, or how they fit together into a national strategy. Well, you might well ask, if they're still not clear, why do they keep on going on about it? But let's let that pass. He also makes the following argument, which in my view offers a far more useful link to Cold War theorizing than rather simple-minded attempts to develop a digital version of mutual assured destruction or some such horror. This is what he said. Interaction and learning. I think we can also conceive of the twin of deterrence by punishment, deterrence by denial. We can conceive of the resilience of the critical national infrastructure as being a modern equivalent, if you like. And perhaps, given the very broad spectrum of activities in cyberspace, and given also that perceived misbehavior in one area might undermine reputation in another, perhaps we could also consider very soft, very norm-building models of deterrence, which I've described elsewhere as deterrence by interdependence and deterrence by association. The purpose with these very soft models should be, first of all, to emphasize the positive sum benefits of cooperation, and second, to establish that there is a set of behaviors which should be considered taboo, and with which governments will be reluctant to be associated for fear of reputational and perhaps therefore even commercial and economic damage. The core argument of what I call deterrence by association, and I made clear when I wrote this that it's not deterrence by proof, it's deterrence by association, it's very political. The core argument is that a political rather than a technological standard of evidence can and should be used, and that governments and the private sector should be encouraged not just to form judgments, but to discuss them more openly as encroachments on the so-called digital commons. If a traditional arms control, Cold War style approach still has appeal, then we might want to think about arms control negotiation, again, as part of this more cautious filtering of old ideas. This might be a way to begin progress. This is the claim that rather than remain attached to the traditional model of negotiated mutual arms control agreements, that governments should return to the idea of unilateral measures as the first step towards inducing reciprocation. In the 50s and 60s, Charles Osgood, who was a psychologist at the University of Illinois, proposed a scheme known as GRIT, Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives in Tension Reduction, founded on the principle that we have reached our present armed state, not as a result of negotiation, but after a long series of unilateral steps. In other words, we didn't really mean to get here. Osgood proposed standing the process on its head by unilaterally reducing arsenals in a measured fashion, eliciting what Steve Weber called perceptions of indebtedness. So perhaps we can think about going about this in a different way. Reciprocation through unilateralism is, of course, an attempt to escape the security dilemma trap. But for our purposes, I think it takes the cyber debate to the point where, in a way, the beneficial consequences of a conversation can be seen and felt, perhaps even without having had the conversation in the first place. Then there's track 2 diplomacy. I know that the US and the UK and the Australian governments are all involved in track 2 discussions with their Chinese counterparts, a very old technique, but no less useful. We could consider regular exchanges between computer emergency response teams, the CERTs. These could become perhaps the cyber equivalent of CBMs, confidence building measures, and perhaps even confidence and security building measures, those talks and measures and agreements of the Cold War. And finally here, the regional aspect. If the problem is that China, for example, simply does not and will not trust the West, and particularly the US, then other familiar tools, again, might be useful. A regional approach might be worth considering along the lines of what Katrina Heinl has called the resilient ASEAN cybersecurity regime. And then the need for cleverness, the new methods. Well, I've got 3 here, and I'll just go through them very swiftly. Trust modeling, first of all. In a way, this is an extension of the security dilemma problem that I just spoke about. We take the principles of trust and confidence building in information architecture, such as identity authentication and validation, etc., and we take all of that into the arena of international cyber diplomacy. Trust is all about generating the expectation of no harm or no betrayal. And so we need to ask whether there are trust models which could be devised in order to cultivate diplomatic and strategic relationships and conversation. Well, I happen to know that there are some very good efforts at trust modeling in cyberspace, such as those being undertaken by Professor Nick Wheeler in Birmingham in the UK. Then we have maturity modeling. The Foreign Office sponsored Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre at Oxford, where I happen to be a fellow, one of the directors of one of the work streams, has begun a project to measure the development and the maturity, as we've called it, of various dimensions of cybersecurity policy, including national cyber policy and defense, cyber responsibility and societal culture, and the policy and legal and regulatory environment. And we're trying to establish a set of metrics for cybersecurity capacity in each of these areas. What capacity exists? What does it do that's any use to anybody? What can it produce in terms of the overarching problem of global cybersecurity? And can that capacity, is there anything we can do to it to enhance it and then perhaps even transfer it under the conditions of best practice and so on? And finally, virtual task forces. This is another pretty basic trust and confidence building exercise which I've been involved in while at Chatham House, and it's grown out of the need for effective and collective response to cybercrime. And we achieved great things simply by providing good offices to government, police, banks, visas and Visa cards and other sorts of financial organizations, just so they could talk to each other without assuming that secrets would be stolen and customer flight would happen and so on. Essentially, VTFs involve participants exchanging critical information to mutually beneficial effect in an impartial and an anonymized environment. It's a sort of basic, low-level, functional cooperation, you might say, for the digital age. And then finally, courtesy, the problem of talking to China. China takes a very close working interest in the international debate concerning the governance of cyberspace. As one of the P5 members of the Security Council, China has contributed recently to the work of 2 UN groups of governmental experts, and the first of which reported to the General Assembly in 2010, and the second under an Australian chair earlier this year. Chinese experts and officials contribute to the standard setting and capacity building work of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, to ICANN, to ITU, and to the World Economic Forum. All of these efforts in cyberspace. Now, I can't record in detail China's contribution to these and other organizations this evening. You'll be very relieved to hear. But I think it's clear, reasonable to say, that China takes a very high level of interest in such work. That said, there are, of course, several initiatives in which China does not participate. No surprise there. And these include informal campaigns such as the Internet Governance Forum and the Stockholm Internet Forum, as well as more formal and more intergovernmental programs such as the Freedom Online Coalition and the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. With so many initiatives, formal and informal, governmental and non-governmental, Chinese officials, in my very limited experience of this, can often be heard to question the source and the authority and the effectiveness and the efficiency of these initiatives. Who has proposed this or that initiative? Why? And under what authority? How can implementation and compliance be measured? How can it be enforced? How can it be verified? I think a conceptual dividing line has become clear. Western governments argue that the governance of cyberspace should be achieved largely using existing frameworks and processes. and that a multi-stakeholder approach is most appropriate, involving governmental, commercial, and non-governmental interests. I heard the other day that there is an acronym for multi-stakeholder, and it's MUSH. Beijing, of course, excuse me, claims that new mechanisms are needed, which should be agreed intergovernmentally. None of this MUSH nonsense. So while Beijing accepts that or rather, they accept MUSH, but the Beijing argument is that MUSH happens under the control of the government. So while Beijing accepts that cyberspace should be governed by an international system of rules, they're happy with that, the perception among Western governments is that China's preference is for any such system to be based upon, given authority by, and reinforcing of the principle of national sovereignty. According to one former UK national security official, the World Conference on International Telecommunications, WICIT, convened by the ITU in December 2012, drew a clear distinction between these two approaches, multi-stakeholder versus intergovernmental. Well, beneath all of this activity, it seems to me that China has two fundamental and closely related concerns. The first is the coherence of Chinese state and society, and the second is international respect for China's sovereignty. I've already referred to Ethan Gutman's argument, which I think could only be regarded in China as a form of digital neoconservatism. Consider the following remark made earlier this year by a lieutenant general in the People's Liberation Army. China's overarching concern, I think, is with maintaining its national sovereignty in cyberspace. In any discussion involving Chinese government officials or representatives or academics, or indeed businessmen and women, in which I've been involved or merely observed, that discussion has very soon turned to sovereignty and to the Chinese insistence that their national sovereignty in cyberspace, as in all things, should be respected. Furthermore, since sovereignty is the attribute of and is exercised by the government of a state, then it follows that any international efforts at regulation or even mere oversight of cyberspace should be intergovernmental. China's emphasis on intergovernmental discussions and negotiation largely explains, I think, its argument that the United Nations should be the focus of internet governance activity. At one level, there's a compelling logic to the Chinese case as I've described it. And I don't think it can very reasonably be contested, to be honest. Cyberspace, it can be argued, is a domain for human interactivity, however much that interactivity is mediated by electronic devices and by software programs. And as such, it cannot be expected to be immune from politics. And in the international system, the state is the principal, albeit not the exclusive locus of politics. And with the modern nation state, so the argument goes, comes sovereignty. The former, the state, cannot exist without sovereignty. So when Chinese interlocutors insist upon respect for their state's sovereignty, this should, in principle, be an unexceptional request, which every other state in the international system could make with equal vehemence. But if the Chinese position on state sovereignty is in a sense unarguable, simple, robust, it shouldn't be inferred that it is necessarily beyond discussion. And this is a key point. I think that by first respecting China's position, it then becomes possible to begin a more searching discussion with them about the nature and the limits, and we've talked with our Chinese colleagues about the elasticity of sovereignty. Importantly, I think Chinese scholars and other commentators are by no means resistant to the notion that sovereignty, together of course with the counterpart obligation of non-intervention, was and is intended, as much as anything else, to be a secure base from which to engage with partners and indeed adversaries in the international system. Sovereignty need not, in other words, provide a rationale for sort of pulling up the drawbridge on international politics. Beyond this basic matter of mutual respect for the sovereignty of states, there's a strong case for investing time and intellectual effort, I think, in developing a clearer idea of what the term sovereignty means in Chinese culture and politics. Analysts in the West often seem inclined to conclude that Chinese colleagues are applying a Western understanding of sovereignty, or perhaps mischievously quoting back the West's own understanding of the term. And this is a largely territorial approach to sovereignty. It's to do with political boundaries, or physical boundaries rather, and borders and coastal waters and national airspace and so on. And you'll have heard this sort of argument made quite a lot. I've made it several times too. So it's not unusual for the claim to be made that the Chinese are taking a crude, quote, territorial approach to the internet and to cyberspace more broadly, insisting that they must control what they own of it. But instead of this rather simplistic view, it could be that for many Chinese, sovereignty is not merely territorial, but is also about the Chinese culture, the coherence of that culture, and the respect it receives for its values and its achievements. And some sense of this can be found in the following passage. But in an important way, even the most sophisticated and open-minded and empathetic discussion of sovereignty overlooks the central difficulty. And I think here we come to the argument that the frequent reference to sovereignty by Chinese officials and analysts and so on is actually representative of a far deeper complaint concerning the organization of the international system itself. And by this view, what is really in contention is nothing less than the rules of the game. So China insists that the established norms and practices of the international system did not all originate in the West. Hence, for example, you might have seen a bit of a debate going on, the claim that soft power is not a recent Western invention or discovery, but it's actually been around for 2,500 years and was Chinese, or is Chinese. Hence, in different parts of China, you find a Sun Tzu business academy, and the neighboring county you find a Sun Tzu theme park. It's all to do with rehabilitating Sun Tzu as an ancient Chinese source of soft power thinking. And that the observance of international norms should be a matter of global consensus rather than Western hegemony, and that these norms can be observed in more than one way. The argument for a more plural understanding of the rules of the international system is fundamental, I think, and it cannot be overlooked. It is no exaggeration to say that China and the West are already in a state of conflict, albeit of a very abstract and a very highly intellectualized sort, and thus far a so-called non-kinetic sort. But if that normative conflict over the rules of the international system is not to become the pretext for a more traditional style of conflict, diplomatic and economic and cultural, then it's best recognized, I think, for what it is and dealt with as a priority. At least for the foreseeable future, this normative conflict, I don't think, will be managed effectively by international organizations purporting to set the rules for the governance of the internet, because in the Chinese view, governance of the internet is a sovereign matter, and as such can only be properly dealt with intergovernmentally. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come to a conclusion. An increasingly significant component of national strategic deliberations worldwide, cyberspace is nevertheless a field in which the extraordinary possibilities of communication have not, and I think this is ironic, have not seen an equivalent increase in trust and confidence-building conversation between governments. There's almost no excuse for there to be more confidence and trust than there is. How easy is it to communicate with absolutely everybody all over the world unless they happen to be in the Chinese government? Instead, the strategic narrative is dominated by mistrust, by claims of espionage and crime and terrorism, by rumors of worse to come from some quarters, and by disagreement over the very terms of debate. At this high strategic level, cyberspace appears to be a sort of lawless frontier environment in which each actor operates according to the rules he or she prefers. I think that governments have arrived at a point of inflection where they must, and I think they can decide, and I don't just mean our governments, I mean all governments, they can decide how the strategic character of cyberspace will develop. And I think there are two choices available very broadly. The first is the positive sum option, whereby governments focus on the possibilities of cooperation and collaboration and coexistence And this is the narrative of, if you like, progressive norms and of positive choice. And these are expressions which I know might seem hopelessly unworldly and idealistic. But what choice have we got? The more serious point here is that unlike any other field of strategic interaction, the sea, the land, the air and outer space, cyber can be understood and shaped as I think its human creators wish. The alternative is the zero-sum narrative of threat and defense. And there are some who liken the current debate about cyberspace to the early years of the Cold War, and particularly to the late 1940s and the early 50s, when the US and the Soviet Union were feeling their way towards some sort of stability through mutual nuclear deterrence, as I spoke about earlier. The argument here is that governments should move as fast as possible through something equivalent for the cyber era to achieve a similar sort of mutual stability. However, while cyberspace remains in what I've described as a state of arrested development, as being pre-strategic and held at the level of speculation rather than strategy, I think that the Cold War analogy, or too much of it perhaps, appears more likely to lead in the direction of an unstable zero-sum competitive narrative. Relaxation of cyber tensions between China and the West, accompanied by change in the behavior of governments, I don't think will come about as a result of a technological fix, and nor will it lie in a Cold War-style strategic standoff. Nor will it be achieved by doing nothing and hoping for the best. Where the cyber confrontation, if I can call it that, differs from the Cold War nuclear confrontation, is that the first of these, the cyber, is at the same time an indispensable global opportunity, cultural and commercial, you name it. So the distinguishing feature for me of the cyber challenge is that there's a need to stabilize cyberspace in order that its manifest and massive benefits can be exploited. And I believe that the pursuit of cyber stability should lie in developing trust and identifying areas of common ground and interest using confidence-building measures and all those other sorts of things I talked about. Now, this is not, ladies and gentlemen, an apology for the Chinese or any other misbehavior in cyberspace. And least of all, do I suggest that we should be in the business of appeasing China. Far from it. I very firmly believe that the rights of sovereignty and the privileges of non-intervention cut both ways. You can't just get the good bits and inflict the bad bits on others. The problem, as I see it, is that we don't really know where we are and what the rules might be. Before we can have an argument about why we should seek allies and how we should react to strategic competitors or adversaries in cyberspace, we need first to have a sense of cyberspace as an ecology, as an environment, in other words, in which the idea of strategy, and strategy is mutual, the idea of strategy is possible. If there are strategic challenges in cyberspace, and it seems to me that there patently are, plenty of them, then we need to ensure that cyberspace is an environment in which strategic solutions can be sought, rather than risk losing all the other benefits of cyberspace with which we've become so familiar. Thank you very much.
Paul's given us a new take on ecology. As a simple biologist who understood ecology to be to do with interactions, and ecologies emerge from the way interactions play out, I think this is a really beautiful intellectual exercise in the way it takes that sort of thinking into the strategic space. But more than that, I'm a scientist that's hung around with a lot of mathematicians over the years, and mathematicians value elegance above all things in their constructs. And Paul, I think what you've given us is an elegant construction of an ecology of cyberspace. So I thank you very much for that. And I would like to open the evening to discussion and questions. And I would like one housekeeping thing, please, to speak up when you ask a question so that the camera can record it. And we'd appreciate it if you tell us your name and where you've come from so that we can get a feel for these for where these comments for your ideas and comments. So if we can have some questions, and I'll pass them to Paul, and we'll see how we go.
Thanks. So I'm Adam Henschke. I'm at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, and I've been looking a little bit recently at stuff to do with trust and cyberspace. So I want to put this, I guess it's a bit of a dilemma to you. I think the trust stuff is really important. I'm really happy that you're bringing it up. But my question is, given at least certain arguments that in the security space and particularly espionage and intelligence, secret things have to happen and you have to do things covertly and those sorts of things, is it possible to actually develop trust? And I'm thinking at the moment of stuff coming out that the US have been spying on Brazil and business leaders in Brazil, as well as the stuff coming about Angela Merkel. If the US is spying on, or if nations are spying on their own, I guess, friends, how is it that we're going to be trying to promote trust between more adversarial relations, say, between China and the US?
I just think that's such a fantastic question. How can we be making arguments for trust with adversaries and so on when we patently don't have sufficient trust within our own polities? Roger began his remarks by describing himself as a simple scientist. Over the last week, we all agreed. We had a political scientist, John, an historian, me, a scientist, a mathematician, and a lawyer. We all agreed at the beginning of the week we would not refer to ourselves as a simple anything. But we found that we had to. And what I've just realised is that we do need a simple philosopher in our team, so you've got a job. This is a difficult one. Of course it is. I don't have an easy answer. I think we've got to insist on building up trusted relations with whoever it might be, whether it be China or Indonesia or whatever else. And if we can't do it directly, we have to have trust models that take us to the place we need to be. And I'm afraid I just think we have to get over this at the moment. I mean, I don't want to trivialize something that is of enormous import. The domestic trust deficit in the UK, the US, Australia, I don't know, wherever else. But we've got to get over that because I think in the end, at the national level, where intelligence and national security are concerned, we as citizens of liberal democracies, I'm a subject, you're citizens, no, are you subjects as well? Anyway, in liberal democracies, I think we've just got to accept the imperfection that there are these things happening on our behalf. And whether we can trust them, I don't know. But I suppose in a way I'm feeling towards a slightly different version of trust at the international level than one that might obtain at the national level. That is a hopelessly inadequate answer to your question, but I suppose I'm saying, yeah, we need structural hypocrisy here.
Another question. I think there was one over here first.
Thank you, Paul. My name's David Sutcliffe. I'm a National Security College alumni. I just want to explore the issue of sovereignty a little bit further, if we could. I mean, despite the fact the Chinese and the West seem to have different views of what it is, at the end of the day, sovereignty is really where you can exert control, and strategy belongs to those who control. The internet and the cyberspace and the evolving ecology was a lovely term I heard there, may even spin out entities, non-state entities, that control. What would happen if China was to go to war with, say, Google as opposed to America, or Anonymous wanted to take out America? Do we actually have an issue of sovereignty there where we have non-state sovereignty, other players involved that we haven't factored in?
You know, I've never thought of that. I would imagine that in the event that that happened, well, let me go back a step. I think you're absolutely right. Sovereignty and strategy is about control and so on, but sovereignty and national security is also about something much bigger than control. It's also about stability and achieving benefits and security more broadly defined over time for the whole of a polity and so on. So much, much thicker, I think, an idea than security against threats. It's also security for doing good. If China declared war on Google, well, I mean, it's come pretty close to it. What would happen? I think it would immediately default to an an intergovernmental, international setting. Because in the end, i.e. my understanding is that every company of any sort, and no matter what the size, has got to be registered somewhere. It's got to have some roots somewhere, and its roots happen to be in something that we are very familiar with. That's to say, the sovereign nation state. So I'm not suggesting that's a preference. I think that's simply the way it would happen. How else could it go? I just don't know.
Yeah, well,
Again, where perhaps the entity is stateless, something like anonymous or a
Catholic Church.
yeah, probably.
Yeah. So in the event that the Catholic Church attacks Australia, I mean, no, don't be silly. Yeah. Yeah. Heaven knows.
Heaven would know. Your question, sir?
Pete Van Ness, Contemporary China Center here at the ANU. I wonder if in this notion of a strategic ecology of cyberspace, if you go back to kind of the base, if we might talk about some of the givens. And the first question that was raised, it seems to me, point to a very important one. And here, I want to take a citizen's perspective rather than a state's perspective. And it seems to me that in terms of citizen security as a point of view, that Edward Snowden's revelations in effect confirm that we are operating in a new world, a world in which the NSA, in collaboration with our Australian Signals Directorate and in collaboration with your government communications headquarters, have created a global system that is capable of invading the privacy of any citizen in the world. Not just our adversaries, or not just our allies or our own citizens, but those Chinese citizens as well. And when they think about a strategic challenge, from their point of view, it seems to me that this is a huge challenge. Now, in your answer to the first question, it seemed to me that you were saying, well, that's a given. We should accept that we have limits on our privacy and electronic communications, from our emails to our health records to our emails to our lovers to what have you. If indeed we should accept that as a given in this new ecology, then what are the implications?
What I think I said is that national security and all that goes with it is a given. And part of what goes with national security is intelligence, and yes, is also espionage. What I did not say is that I would either condone or accept or prefer the invasion of privacy on a global level that you've just attributed to me. So I don't think I said that, and I don't think it's what I'd want. And I don't, to be quite honest, see that this is what this global collaboration between the NSA, ASD, and GCHQ are all about. I might be completely wrong, and you might be completely right, but my sense is that the signals intelligence and information gathering organizations are frankly not interested in the emails that you're sending to your lover. They don't want that stuff. And even though they can get it, sorry?
Unless they think I'm a terrorist.
Precisely.
But they have the capacity.
Yeah, but you're inferring from capacity intention, and I'm not sure that that connection works quite as straightforwardly as that. That's where we'd have to differ. Unless you're a terrorist, you said it yourself. That's what national security is all about, isn't it?
Hi, I'm Twin Yuin from the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. My question is, I was wondering whether the Budapest Convention is the sole international instrument to concentrate and push forward and get states to ratify, or is there something better than having a convention, a treaty?
I think very briefly, there's no doubt that there could be better things than the Budapest Cybercrime Convention, but there is nothing better at the moment. So if it could be given momentum by full signatory, or indeed just expanded as far as it possibly can, and then emulated, then I think we would be onto a good thing. At the moment, I think it falls into the into the debate I was trying to describe, really, that it is it is not meeting China's requirements or China's preferences for the way these sorts of measures ought to be organised, and that's why it's not signing up. And I think if we could get more will behind it, then I think it would go much.
What's China's arguments for not getting on board with the Budapest
To
Convention?
the extent that I'm familiar with their position on that precise initiative, I think it's the nature of the cooperation, that it should be, that they, as I said, their default setting is intergovernmental, and it's also designing things to fit the problem rather than, but others might know better than I do about exactly what their position is. Nobody?
Thank you. There was another question there, that's right. Yes, thank you.
I'm Professor Andrew Kirby, I'm a student at the SCSC here. I was very interested in the logic you make about sovereignty, particularly its appeal to China. But I'm just curious, I guess, with a couple of analogies. The first with the Cold War metaphor you spoke about, which is a very dyadic relationship, and certainly one that very few people could buy into. And the second, I guess, is the response that China's taken over the South China Sea and a number of other territorial disputes where, when looking at resolution mechanisms, such as the UN Law of the Sea, the Chinese have taken a perspective that the current state of play, particularly diplomatic, legal mechanisms, disadvantages them. There's an inherent imbalance in the existing system of state interaction. So just in that context where, I guess, cyber and cyber strategy is asymmetric to an extent, gives you a cheaper buying capacity to get in and influence the game. If China would really be on board with levelling the playing field at this stage, where it still feels there is a global strategic imbalance prejudiced against
Well, I don't know about China's position on the UNCLOS and all that, so I take your point. This is not something I'm familiar with, but I'm more familiar with China's position as far as internet governance or cyberspace governance is concerned. And my sense is, as I said in my talk, that the Chinese preference is for these measures and actions to be defaulted to the United Nations, where, after all, what the United Nations is largely about, apart from all the words in the preamble, is largely about the interaction of states. So that's where it wants to be as far as developing governance norms and processes and treaties and so on in cyberspace are concerned. Does that answer your question?
Darren Wolf, Attorney General's Department. What about the internet becoming a sovereign state of its own?
Wow, that's...
UN with, suggestion of UN getting involved in its governance. We have a virtual currency that's seems to be growing in its use. The internet seems to be...
What an intriguing idea, yeah. What an absolute intriguing idea, where if you take arguments for making cyberspace into more of a political ecology, as we've called it, take that to the full extent and it becomes the vision, or perhaps it is the nightmare of global electronic governance. I don't know, but it sounds like such an intriguing idea. I'm going to plagiarise it and mull it over. Thank you very much.
I was just sort of following on from that. Isn't what we're actually going down the road that is actually applied to the maritime environment, where states have a certain amount of coastline which they have sovereign responsibility over, but once you get out into the deeper waters, it is in effect managed by mutual agreement?
I think there are useful analogies with the other commonses. There are, no doubt about it. But the difficulty I have with the coastal shelf analogy and airspace and so on is that the problem is that the minute you go onto what we would understand as the internet, you go universal. So there is no boundary. You're either in it or you're not. And the minute you're in it, that's it. And so the solution then is, as we've been debating it for a week, not solution, but the consequence might then be that you only begin to manage it by imposing some sort of a coastal waters definition or some sort of an airspace definition. And that, of course, is the balkanization of the internet. That might be the way we're going. But if we're going in that direction, it's not the internet as we know it. That's the point, I think.
I just have this sense that 300 years ago we could have been having the same conversation about piracy and the Spanish galleon fleets and Yeah, states versus non-states and so on.
I agree. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion to have. The other point I make about the commons is, and I didn't really touch on this, is that there is quite an involved debate about whether cyberspace is a commons as such. You could say that the high seas are a commons and the village green is a commons and so on and so forth. The counter to the argument that there is a global technological commons, as I've called it and others have called it, is that can't be the case, because it basically is run by machines that are made by your company and are plugged in somewhere, and someone cleans them and keeps them plugged in, etc., etc. So it is actually manufactured. It is existing. Someone owns it somewhere. I fully accept that. My point on this, though, is that whether we like it or not, the however billions of people who are going to be on this thing by the end of the decade, as far as they're concerned, as far as we're concerned, we all consider it to be a commons. So something curious has happened. Something that is not commons, that is manufactured, has all of a sudden become an assumed commons. And I don't know, that doesn't do anything to answer your question whatsoever, but I think it shows that, for me, it shows that analogies with maritime and air and so on are useful, but we've got to be very careful about how far we push them.
I think the privacy concerns are interesting because they're about our expectation, that what we did over the internet was private, being disproved. Because in effect, what governments can do with electronic communications is no more than they could do with telephone communications or postal communications 50 years ago.
Again, I think we were having a discussion earlier today, and this is more of a conversation than a Q&A, but this is a good one. And the point came up that those of us of a certain age who are not the so-called digital natives take one view of privacy and information and access thereto. All those others, the digital natives below a certain age, couldn't give a toss. Quite crudely, couldn't give a toss. They don't mind that their Facebook page is read. They keep hearing these warnings about if you have your university party filmed and put onto the web, it'll come back and bite you when you go for a job as a grown-up and all that kind of stuff. They don't mind. Who cares? If anybody really wants to read my emails, then I don't really care, because the trade-off is that I've got Google for free. It's a different world, I think. But again.
Perhaps on that note, I think we should wrap. Thank you everyone for those questions, they were terrific. And I'd like you to join me in thanking Paul for a terrific